Okay, so we're going to be looking at turning our attention to Asia, in particular China, while we're also looking at other countries around China as well. Um, so we're going to kind of backtrack before World War One and World War Two, and kind of build up into modern day China. So if we remember, China was one of the places that got us going in the first place. This whole semester, it was the place that the Europeans were trying to go to do trade. Unlike Japan, China had was more open in taking in the European traders and missionaries. And then moving around the 19th century, that began the inroads, particularly of the British into China. Things like the Opium Wars that started to weaken up the Qing dynasty until finally, with all the other little battles, like the Boxer Rebellion, etc., kind of led to the ruin of the Qing dynasty and a movement towards modernism in China. So you see this focus on modernism in China with things like the New Cultural Movement, which was a youth movement. Same thing with the May 4th movement of 1919. So these are modernist movements trying to end or leading to the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of the Chinese Republic. So Lu Xun's literature is reflective of this new cultural movement of modernity. And then Sun Yat-sen is considered kind of the father of the Chinese Republic, and um, gets China kind of on the finally on the road that Japan had already been on. So, however, once you move into like the 1920s, you don't really have a strong central leadership. You have China filled with competing groups for power. Now, there's two major political groups that are going to come out of this. That is the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. And at times, these will be groups that'll work together to try to gain control of China, since both of these are modernist parties. However, the nationalists will turn on the communists, and the communists are almost taken out by the nationalists. In fact, this leads to Mao's famous mountain trek, where he escapes and the communists travel up the mountains and get refuge among the peasantry. And this experience is very important for Mao because he tends to idealize the peasants. Then you get the Japanese invasion beginning in the late 1930s, and China will kind of come together, join the Allies to fight against the Japanese. Um, World War II is over. The nationalists turn again on the communists instead of trying to rebuild China. And this leads to a war between the two. And by the time the 40s are over, China is now controlled by the Communist Party. So 1949, big year. That's when the People's Republic of China begins. Okay, so let's talk about Mao's rule over China. So Mao is very much like some of the other communist dictators we've looked at. He his face is everywhere, and he's somebody who is kind of a cult of following goes with him. Um, he likes Stalin, so this is where there's a similarity because some of these terms kind of overlap. So he wants to do land reforms and reform, quote, through labor. So this should sound familiar to like what Stalin did in the late 20s and the 30s. He puts together a 5-year plan to push China towards industrialization. And then following that, there is what's known as a Great Leap Forward. And this Great Leap Forward is pretty disastrous for the Chinese economy. There's famine that goes along with food shortage, and everybody's kind of lying about who's responsible. In fact, it's basically the strategy of government is mostly responsible for the disaster of the millions of lives lost in these programs. So Mao is kind of seen as the old man out as the early '60s are coming into place. However, there is a cultural shift that happens mid 1960s. For starters, when China became communist in 1949, they quickly became kind of situated with the Soviet Union as like the two major communist countries. However, when Nikita Khrushchev began his de-Stalinization, basically talking about how bad Stalin was, Mao begins to distance himself from the Soviet Union, and people see this as this idea of the cult of leader. And so, of course, Mao would be breaking away from this because China has this kind of cult of Mao. Um, so he's kind of seen himself being pushed to the side. He kind of got this new guard, this new young leadership on the horizon. And so the reaction of Mao is to initiate what's known as the Cultural Revolution. And you begin to have these purges of China, particularly of what are seen as a quote unquote traditional or bourgeois element that have kind of snuck into China. And so doctors and teachers, grandparents, parents, etc., are oftentimes called out by students. The Red Guard have this; they're kind of primary example of this cult of Mao. You can kind of see in this picture here of the Red Guard holding the little red book of Mao, and so they'll do anything for him. And there's a lot of public shaming that happens of anybody who is seen as quote unquote revisionist. And so many of these people I mentioned are sent off into the fields to do reform through labor. In fact, many of the Red Guard as well are sent to the fields to do this. This all happens pretty much in the late 1960s. Again, it's kind of a scary time in China when this is happening. But Maoism is kind of seen as a darling of the radical left in the 60s. I mean, there's stories of like guerrilla movements from the global South, but even like American radicals, Black Panthers, and whatnot who travel to China, French radicals as well. Um, but not everybody was radical that traveled to China. In fact, kind of what's a big deal, even in our world, is the fact that the American president, Richard Nixon, so now we're talking early 70s, Nixon travels and does these open negotiations with Zhou and Lai. And you get this movement of U.S. détente. One reason why the U.S. Does this is it wants to weaken the Soviet Union and force the Soviet Union to do these SALT treaties, basically denuclearize. And so the Cold War begins to kind of get thawed out, especially in China, because the U.S. has not really spoken to China since the Korean War, right? In the Korean War, China got more directly involved. So it's going on about 20 some plus years that it's kind of been a frozen relationship between China and U.S. And with Nixon's visit to China, and then the next leader of China, Deng Xiaoping's visit to the U.S., you begin to have the breakdown of that Cold War and more of this um, interesting relationship that is built between China and the United States ever since then. So Deng, in fact, is he'll be on your test, so make sure you know this. He was somebody who survived the purges and was somebody who believed in a more pragmatic socialism. In fact, you can kind of give him credit for this idea of a socialist market economy. And so, what you're seeing in China today, I mean, there is some difference with the current leadership of China, but in recent times, the way that China is so much directly involved in the market economy, it kind of flows from the ideas of Deng. The one way you can see this is instead of this kind of idealistic Maoism that was being practiced, you have the four modernizations, and you can see them there. That Deng is putting all the attention into those four ideas, and there's a little bit, you could argue there's a lot more democracy happening between the late the mid to late 70s and the 80s and 90s. And again, some would argue um, current leadership, there's kind of a return to some oppressive policies. But I would say even in the 1980s, when obviously things were better than the Cultural Revolution, you did have the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. There's famous pictures here of the one person standing in front of the tanks that you see. This is famous moment of a student sit-in that happened for a couple of months, and you can watch the video here. It kind of goes into that. Okay. So real quick, I'll wrap up Asia in about 3 more minutes. I have to be a little quick here and try to hit on the stuff that's going to be on your exam. So we saw the communist option in China, but in general, outside of if you look at the rest of Asia, the areas that get a lot of attention are one, obviously Japan, because the U.S. Occupied post-war Japan, helped it to become independent and one of the strongest economies in all of the world throughout the late 20th century. And finally, Japan adopted a more robust liberal democracy for the first time. So this turned to kind of a U.S. style democracy capitalism has done wonders in Japan. Same thing applies to what has been nicknamed by the quote unquote West, the four tiger countries. So that's a term that Western economists gave countries like Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. And the reason they did this is because these all also had robust economies. So this was oftentimes utilized as kind of a way to say, like, okay, look at Asia. Asia has modernized really well, and places like Singapore here, this picture here, has become like a modern capital, very much built like a Western European city. Now, the thing is, this was under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew had basically came up with the idea that said, like, look, in order for Asian countries like Singapore to compete, it had to create a modernist capital that would be the best at exporting manufacturers, and that's what it has become. Now, this is especially if you look at that and juxtapose it with the post-colonial world of French Vietnam or French Indochina, where the Vietnam War occurred, and even the violence that bled into Pol Pot here, and the killing fields, where in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge tried to basically force collectivization through labor on the people of Cambodia, and this whole nightmare scenario is nicknamed the Killing Fields. So the Vietnam War and Cambodia serve as like the alternative examples, negative examples to like the success in countries like Japan and Singapore.